It's EdPsych for Music Educators, Part 2, Decolonizing Edition. Today we're going to be absolutely destroying Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs seems really basic and kind of honestly useless for music educators, because it kind of is, and it also completely reeks of capitalism and colonialism. In Maslow's pyramid, it starts with basic physical needs and works up to self-actualization, which is basically being your full self. The plot twist in all of this is that Maslow actually completely appropriated this from First Nations people in what is now Alberta, Canada, the Blackfoot Nation. In the Blackfoot Nation's hierarchy of needs, self-actualization is the base and cultural perpetuity is the top. As music teachers, we know that connection and belonging and beauty is just as essential as all other physical needs. I go with the Blackfoot Nation. It's EdPsych for Music Teachers, Part 3. Today we're talking about the ZPD, the Zone of Proximal Development. So in Vygotsky's social learning theory, the zone of proximal development is this kind of sweet spot, the Goldilocks zone between what is too easy for a student and what is too difficult for a student. What's special about the ZPD is that it isn't just this right spot for what to teach your student, it's that it's what a student is capable of doing with help, hence the social learning theory. So what's important to note for music teachers is that we usually have our students playing or singing in a group, and sometimes you may think that something is actually too easy for a student, but it's actually right in their zone of proximal development. They can only do it with help. So it's really important to get that solo time or one-on-one time, even if it's just a couple of seconds to hear them play or sing, so that you can better assess where they are in their abilities and keep them in their zone of proximal development instead of frustrating them. All right, it's Educational Psychology for Music Teachers, Part 4, and today we're talking about creativity. You would think it would be very obvious that creativity should be a part of any music classroom, but actually, since creativity refers to specifically creating something new, a new interpretation, a new melody, new ornamentation, style, what have you, creativity actually doesn't happen in a lot of music classrooms. Unfortunately, since there's so much emphasis on technique, getting everybody to play or sing the same thing at the same time, we often forget to be creative. So students who are more naturally curious or have a higher level of divergent thinking or insight ability are more likely to have an easy time being creative. However, music teachers can encourage more creativity by involving more playtime in their classroom, by putting an emphasis on having a trusting classroom environment, and putting more clearly defined parameters on more creative experiences. It's Educational Psychology for Music Teachers, Part 5. Today we're talking about stage fright. Stage fright is totally normal for beginners all the way through experts and professionals, so it's just part of the process. We have to learn how to deal with it. So let's teach our students how to deal with it. When someone experiences stage fright, they're not actually afraid of the stage. They're afraid of disappointing themselves. They're feeling overly critical. They're afraid of disappointing other people, or they're afraid of the feelings that they're physically feeling. What I mean by that is when you have all these psychological factors that are making you feel anxious, it creates a physical somatic response in your body, and that feeds back into feeling more nervous. So teachers, here's 2 quick tips. First of all, for big auditions or things like that, do mock auditions. They need the practice. Also, intentionally instruct students on ways to calm themselves before and during a performance so that they can accept how their body is feeling and still perform at a high level. It's EdPsych for Music Teachers, Part 6. Today we're talking about self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the belief that you have the skills and the ability and the capacity to achieve a particular goal. Boy, doesn't that sound exactly like confidence? It sort of is confidence, but you can have confidence that you will fail at something. So self-efficacy is specifically about a positive achievement. Though you probably will see an increase in self-efficacy throughout a learning process for a new skill for your students, you do want to look for hints and encourage self-efficacy throughout the learning process for a new skill. So here's what you're looking for and you need to encourage for higher levels of self-efficacy. First thing is their level of intrinsic motivation. Second thing is their ability to plan ahead and make goals. And third thing is that they are making positive goals and imagining positive outcomes. And fourth is their ability to overcome failure and take in negative feedback. It's Ed Psych for Music Educators Part 7, and today we're talking about executive function. Executive function is the cognitive part of self-regulation, and an easy way to think about that is that it's basically the air traffic control for your brain. Executive function is all of the many mental processes that go on in our brain that help us plan, remember directions, manage distractions, figure out what order to do things in, all of the little things that make tasks happen. So in the music class, executive function is on overdrive. We use it at a very high level in the music class all the time. And research has shown that music education can really help support the development of executive function skills. If you have a student in your class whose IEP indicates that they struggle with executive function, it doesn't mean that they're not smart or musical or creative. It just means that they need a little bit of help with air traffic control, and music can help them with that. It's Ed Psych for Music Educators Part 8, and today we're talking about growth mindset. Growth mindset is the idea that we are capable of improving our talent or our intelligence or our other abilities, that we're not stuck or fated to have one level of competency through our entire lives. And this is super important because if kids think that they are fated to be stuck in one place, they're not going to be putting in the work to improve. Because it's time for Educational Psychology Part 9, if you can believe it. Today we're talking about moral development. So moral development is a little bit more on the human development side than the educational psychology side, I know, but moral development is talking about how throughout your life you develop things like caring and altruism and respect. So the more famous theory of moral development comes from psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg. The problem with his theory, however, is that it was developed by a study he did by only studying boys, because girls don't have moral development. Luckily, his student Carol Gilligan came up with studies that, address the rest of the population, and they came up with similar theories that have important distinctions. So her research showed that girls like to maintain interpersonal relationships when there's moral and ethical issues, and boys tend to have a more justice-based system where you're right and you're wrong and you win and you lose. That's it. Gotta make this a two-parter to tell you all the stages. Ed Psych for Music Teachers Part 9, Part 2. This is all the stages of moral development, so you get all that good information. Okay, so both of the developmental psychologists that I talked about in Part 1, they both came up with basically 3 different stages: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. And yes, that does sound like Piaget on purpose. So pre-conventional, we're talking about your younger kids, pre-adolescents, little kids. They are motivated when it comes to issues of ethics and morals by fear and self-preservation. What's in it for me? What do I get out of this? Will I get in trouble? Teenagers, big surprise, are mostly influenced by peer pressure. What is the social norms that we're dealing with in this ethical issue? Interestingly, a lot of adults kind of plateau on the next portion, which is about maintaining law and order. It's the rule, the end. Some adults never get to the post-conventional stage, which is true altruism and how rules actually impact every member of society. Consider all these things when you're making your classroom rules and expectations. It's Ed Psych for Music Educators Part 10, and today we're talking about the flow state. The flow state is when you are so engrossed in learning or being or creating or working that everything else seems to disappear, including time. When we hit the flow state, our conscious minds actually turn off, even though what we're doing is perfectly challenging, and everything feels effortless. In fact, if you try to interrupt somebody who's in a flow state, you might actually startle them. As a music teacher, you've probably experienced this in your own personal practice or maybe in an incredible performance or rehearsal. So you can't force the flow state to happen, but here's a couple of ideas to encourage flow to happen in your music class. The first is to aim for your students' proximal zone of development, and if you're not sure what that is, there is an Ed Psych for Music Educators reel on that. The second is to give your students plenty of options for their creative activities in your class, and do your best to limit distractions when being creative.